But within an appropriate governance framework. Okay? So maybe you've got some milestones in place. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Some good things to do that the team should be aware of. Like my example about technology choices. Maybe governance says that you don't just put in new frameworks, new libraries and things because you found this open source thing out there on the net. You actually talk to somebody first. That's appropriate governance. Right? The slide says that there's lots of people out there who are claiming to be agile. They're doing these 5 things to some degree, or they're moving to them. That's kind of the point of this, is people are either, they believe that they are already good at this, or they are trying to do so. Okay? But the reality is, people aren't actually getting the results that management's expecting. Okay? And there's many, many reasons for that. It will take more time than I got to discuss today, but I'll go through some of it. If you ask management what matters to them, there seems to be this misunderstanding that we all think that management actually wants us to deliver to a predefined scope, a predefined budget, and a predefined schedule with a given level of quality. But you know, Scott's surveys say that it's remarkable how flexible our business really is. Would you prefer to build a system to a predefined specification? Only 4% said yes. 80% would prefer to actually adjust their needs as they go and deliver what's really valuable to their customers. So it's the process that's the problem. It's not what the customers want. It's the process that we enforce in many cases, this restrictive waterfall traditional process. So the bottom line is only 12% of respondents actually want those 3 things. Okay? I'm a big proponent of delivering to schedule, delivering to a cost, which is easy, it's just a factor of people times time, and allowing the scope to be the flexible thing. And making sure that, of course, what we deliver to them is the high business value. But we've done a lousy job as an industry of getting any of those 3 things right. None, right? We typically spend triple the money, triple the schedule, and end up delivering something that is to a predefined spec that doesn't meet their business needs. Is it any wonder we have a bad reputation? So if we can just deliver on time, deliver on the budget, spend the budget we said we were, and then allow the customer to pick what's the most important scope to them and deliver that, I believe, and I know, we end up with a much better relationship with business. So are you experiencing any of these pain points? Now these questions go to agile teams, not just the traditionalists in the audience here. Do you have requirements backlogs that seem to keep growing? You know, agile, your product owners keep adding stuff into your backlog, and it seems you're blowing the money, you're going through time, and sure, you've delivered lots of good stuff, but it seems there's still lots of stuff yet to deliver. Do you find defects late in the project, poor quality, hard to maintain code, misunderstanding with the business about whether or not agile is truly adding value? Lots of good stuff going on in Scrum teams, but sometimes the business still doesn't know whether or not they're getting good value for their dollar. Sometimes, unfortunately, agile is viewed as uncontrolled hacking. And anybody here who is a Scrum master, who's had some success on Scrum teams, knows that Scrum or extreme programming is far more disciplined than the method that they're probably using in the organization beforehand. Right? So, you know, people ask us, why do we call it disciplined agile? Are you suggesting that Scrum's not disciplined? Absolutely not. And by the way, if you want to learn more about DAD, if you go to disciplinedagiledelivery.com, that's where Scott and I blog about the latest and greatest on DAD, because it continues to evolve. And in there, I've written, and Scott has too, a few blogs about what it means to be disciplined on agile projects. And it's just taking the discipline that already exists in mainframe methods such as Scrum and extreme programming, but taking it to the next level. Do you have a project management office that demands detailed plans, requirements, and specification that Agile doesn't have? This is a constant source of a disconnect between the project management offices and Agile groups, because PMOs want sign-offs of all these documents along the way, which isn't consistent with Agile, because in many cases we don't have those documents, because we know they don't actually provide any value. So there is that disconnect. In Disciplined Agile Delivery, we spend an entire chapter, chapter 20, describing how to adapt governance for Agile projects. And I've helped customers with this, and it makes all the difference in the world because there's different measurements. But should you expect to have to govern Agile projects? For many Agile purists, the word governance is a dirty word. And that's kind of a shame. Because isn't it fair? Shouldn't our business expect us to report the health of the project, whether we're on track? Just because we're producing working software every 2 weeks, there's more questions to ask than that. Anyway, I got some slides coming up on that, so I'll defer it. How does DAD help? Excuse me. Filling in these gaps. The DAD is people first, which means, and it's a common Agile principle. If you don't have good teams that work well together, you're going to fail. It doesn't matter. All the rest is irrelevant, right? Goal-driven. A lot of methodologies state that you must do these work products or these artifacts or these documents. Thou shalt do not just documents, thou shalt do unit tests, thou shalt do this and this and this. We try to take the prescriptive nature out of DAD, and we have. But we know that every project has a set of common goals. How you fulfill those goals, there's ideal Agile practices to use, but you know what? You might be in an organization where you actually have to do things that aren't pure Agile practices. And if you do, what's the best alternative while still being as Agile as you can? So if you use a goal-driven approach, which I'm going to show you, you will have more flexibility while still being Agile. So this DAD, it's very important to understand, DAD is not another methodology. Okay? Please, we do not need another methodology. There's great stuff going on in existing methods. We want to use those, and maybe what DAD is a cohesive set of these practices, but it's not a method. It is a process decision framework. It helps you make better decisions to fulfill the goals of your project without telling you what to do. And I'll show you examples of that a little bit later. It's a hybrid Agile. I'm going to actually go through slides of these, so I'll keep moving here. We do focus on risk, not just mitigating risk, not just delivering value to customers, and enterprise aware. I've talked a bit about that, the necessity to be enterprise aware. So it's a hybrid of existing methods, things like the SAFe framework, extreme programming, Agile modeling, which is work that Scott has done over the years. There's a lot of Scrum, a lot of extreme programming in the framework. And using those things, it helps us deal with some of these complexity factors that I talked about earlier, with team sizes and distribution, etc. Now, Scrum is foundational to DAD. So if you know Scrum, you'll recognize this picture. You don't really have time to go into it in too much depth, but suffice it to say that in Scrum, we don't have a detailed listing of requirements. We have this thing called a backlog, which is a prioritized list of things, or they represent the requirements. They're known as user stories. They're prioritized by value. So the highest, it's like a stack. The highest value stuff is at the top. And what Scrum calls a sprint, we call an iteration. We take off the highest value ones, as many as the team is capable of delivering within, say, a 2-week period, and then we build them. And that's what we call, Sprint calls an iteration a sprint. We call it an iteration. Scrum has a daily meeting they call a scrum, and we call it a daily meeting. But so we're talking a little bit about terminology, but the key point about terminology is use whatever terminology makes sense for you. If you've been using Scrum for years, there's no reason to start calling it an iteration, right? If you call your daily meetings a scrum, call them scrums. We don't care. There was a time when I was a little bit younger and a little bit more dogmatic where I say, don't call it a scrum, call it a daily meeting. Don't call it an iteration or sprint because it's an iteration. Now I really don't care. But I do care, but not as much. Because if you're in new organizations that new to Agile, then why use a proprietary term? Why don't you just, like, if we're a hybrid of 10 different methods and 8 of them call it an iteration, why don't we call it an iteration rather than confuse our customers? But again, whatever works for you. If you want to call it a sprint, I've got no problem with that whatsoever. So that's generally the Scrum idea. There's a set of ceremonies, we call them, within Scrum that are, taken together, are a wonderful thing. They provide team focus on delivering every 2 weeks, and they're very motivated to deliver what they promised from the top of the stack of the backlog to the customers. Very, very good. If you start to use pieces of the framework, like just the daily Scrum, and that's it, you're not doing Scrum, first of all, and you won't be successful. You have to kind of use them together. Okay? And I know there's some Scrum people in the audience. I'm sure they would agree. So what DAD does is we take a full life cycle approach. What you see, and there's 3 phases here. We have an inception phase where we do a little bit of upfront planning, a little bit of requirements envisioning, architecture envisioning. Please, this is not water, Scrum, fall. Please, please, please. Okay. We want this to be as lightweight as possible, like a 4-page document on the wiki, maybe 20 pages, whatever you need to do. Again, DAD is pragmatic agile. Somebody in my last workshop, pointed out that the acronym for pragmatic agile is PAW, and this is the DAD framework. Interesting. I thought it was kind of funny. I don't know. But that's 2 words to explain what DAD is. It's pragmatic agile. So you would decide how much work you need to do before you jump in and start coding. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then construction is like Scrum and extreme programming together. It's iterations or sprints, building stuff, building stuff, building stuff, and at some point you transition it to the customer. Ideally, you transition it to the customer at the end of each sprint or every iteration. But for many organizations, it's not practical to actually deliver software to the customer every 2 weeks. If you can do that, that's awesome. I'm very proud of you. But the reality is most larger organizations need to go through a number of iterations before they have enough value to justify deploying it into production. And by the way, deploying into production is not trivial in many organizations, as I mentioned before. If you have a development environment, a test environment, a staging environment, a production environment, other environments, just moving this stuff between the environments. And by the way, coordinating it with 50 other applications, right? Not trivial. And then there's all the paperwork. So we recognize that's what's going on in reality, and we have a phase called transition to deal with that. So that's at the super high level. If you look at Scrum, that I showed you before, you can put it on top and see that Scrum really runs as the construction phase. We also have milestones here because we recognize that some level of governance is a good thing. And at times it does make sense for somebody who's funding your project to give them a few answers regarding what's going on. If you're going to spend some time sort of framing up the project in this thing called inception, maybe you want to get together and make sure that you have stakeholder consensus that the project makes sense. It makes sense to proceed as planned. Or not. Can the project. Or buy a package. Or something. Then we have this thing called proven architecture, which says this is where DAD adds to the value. Scrum prioritizes work by value. The most important stuff to the customer goes at the top of the stack. DAD recognizes that sometimes there's tricky bits. I call the high value stuff juicy bits, and the stuff that's really hard, tricky bits. There's some tricky bits in your application that if you don't figure out, you may fail. As an example, I was a team lead for a super large project, the largest project I've ever worked on, where we had to deliver a system for Canadian Pacific for 16,000 users that had to have 3-second response time. And the project had failed twice before I arrived, with many, many millions of dollars spent. In fact, they put it out to pilot, and it choked after about 30 users, 30, okay? So they couldn't afford to get this wrong again, and they asked me to come in and help. And we did, it works, it's great. But the mistake there is that they did not prove the architecture early on and figure out that the first candidate architecture that they used was not going to do the job. So what we do in DAD is say, combine delivering high value with mitigating risk by doing the tricky bits at the same time. Hopefully you can deliver juicy bits and tricky bits as part of the same stories of requirements. And then, so we have a checkpoint with our sponsors, our stakeholders to say, so as me as a team lead can go to them and say, I feel comfortable that we've mitigated our highest technical risks. That's a good tick box for people who are doing governance of your project. At several times, we may have milestones to consider the viability of the project. Are we still doing well? Do we want to keep spending money? Maybe we're ready to release early. Who knows? Those kinds of things, right? And then we're going to have milestones for going live sometimes takes a number of weeks, and if it does, We have a go, no-go decision. And then are we done going into, is our project done the day we go live? Probably not, right? We're going to have some time afterwards to maybe do some tuning, do some defect fixes, those kinds of things. So the customer isn't truly delighted and ready to sign off the project until sometime after the go, no-go decision, or after the go-live date. So this life cycle causes some grief with the Agile community, because they don't like to admit the projects actually do have this full life cycle approach, but they do. That's what's going on in organizations, okay? And I'll tell you a little bit more about that shortly. We also have, so that what you saw was, this is what we call the Scrum-based or basic DAD life cycle. But there are other people out there. I don't know if, has anybody out there heard of Lean or Kanban? Okay, yeah, a lot of people have. Less than Scrum, but increasingly Lean and Kanban is becoming quite popular. And by the way, driven from business, not driven from IT. Lean is a real hot term, a buzzword in business. And I have a customer actually who the CEO talked to the CIO to say, we're Lean at our company. How about you guys in IT? Right? I get the phone call. Mark, what's this Lean stuff all about? It's in my performance objectives now. Don't know how I got there, but so there is this Lean model, which is not, it's not iteration based. It's not sprint based like Scrum is. The idea is I have a pool of work and I pull something off and I build it, and I pull something off and I build it. I'm not constrained by a 2-week iteration. I'm not constrained by the ceremonies of Scrum, but it's a little bit more ad hoc, well, because it doesn't have the ceremonies. It can be a great thing. It talks about minimizing work in progress and documents and all that, some really good ideas. My experience and opinion is that it's also known as, an approach is also known as Kanban, for monitoring your work as you go. In my experience says it's very easy to learn. It's very trivial. It's an easy idea. You have pools of, you can prioritize rather than by business value, by different ways, like by business, sorry, not just business value, but also fixed delivery dates, some stuff that has to be done by a certain date, stuff that has to be expedited. Oh my goodness, we need to fix this right away. And then another pool where stuff is intangible. So you can prioritize things in a different way. It's easy to learn how to put stuff into those pools and pull them off and build them and pull them off and build them. What's harder though, and the reason we call it advanced, is that it's harder to track the throughput. Now you can track the throughput. So how fast is the team going? Are they going, with Scrum, I have a 2-week commitment. And I know, I can see what the team is delivering every 2 weeks, and they're very motivated to do so because they made a promise to the customer owner. If you're just sort of pulling stuff and working on it, pulling it, working on it, you know, are you going as fast as you can? Really hard to tell. You can measure it, but it's a little harder to measure and it's harder to motivate. Okay, so this is advanced. Some teams love it and some teams are very good at it, but I might recommend Scrum is a really good place to start. Now there's a religious battle. In the Agile world, you've got different camps, and some people say Scrum sucks, and some people would say the same about Lean. We're pragmatic Agile, PA, right? Let you do what you think makes sense. Now, in the Scrum-based approach, hopefully, you know, this is not optimal. We don't like big iterations of, big inception phases and big transition phases. Hopefully over time, you realize you don't need to do so much planning. Certainly a second release of a product, you already have a backlog of requirements that are still remaining to do. You don't need to go through the exercise of creating that from scratch, setting up your tooling and those kinds of things. You're ready to roll. Your inception for your second release should be shorter. And same thing with your transition. You've got some automated deployment processes in place, hopefully. So going into production is not such a big deal. The idea is you should get better and better as you go and eventually eliminate those phases. Some organizations never will because they're ITIL organizations or whatever. Now there's one more model, which is the Google model. This is where you're using a lean approach and you're grabbing something and you're building it and you're deploying it. You're giving it to the customer every day. I can't remember which example it was, but somebody just told me there's an organization out there that does 40 deployments into production every single day. Is that Facebook? Might have been Facebook. Yeah. So some people are really good at this, but it's not the reality for many organizations and never will be. Okay? But this is a good thing to strive for. So that whole picture is one day, what you see here. Okay, got to pick up the pace a little bit. DAD is goal-driven, as I said. So what you see in the book is this goal diagram that shows in inception, everybody has these common goals. It doesn't matter if you're a COTS application or if you're building from scratch. You got to form your team. You should have some common project vision. Check out your enterprise guidelines, assets, etc. Find out what everybody else is up to and what your constraints are. Like we do Java, so don't even think about .NET as an example. Explore your initial scope. Management doesn't want to see, if you guys know what a user story is, as a customer, I can withdraw cash so that I can pay my bills or whatever. If you've got 200 of those, management doesn't want to see the requirements written like that. What is this? As a. Trust me, CIOs don't want to read that. They will read a list of 15 or 20 great features that you will do for this release on one 8.5, or you guys use A4? I was going to say 8.5 by 11. Right? They'll read that. So that's the example of the kind of level that you would want to do things in inception. Okay? And then what technical strategy are you going to use? Just draw a couple pictures of what the architecture might look like. Develop an initial release plan. Okay, we're going to build software every 2 weeks. That's awesome. But how many of them are there going to be before we go live? Over the next year, how many go lives are we going to have? We would call them transitions. That's a release plan. Some initial estimating, albeit at a high level. You got to set up the work environment. You got to actually get the money. And identifying risks is a good thing to do. Right? Risk management doesn't go away. One of the sad things I see in some failed Scrum projects is they take their best developer on the team with a little bit of leadership capability and make them the Scrum Master, and that person doesn't have any project management experience. So they don't understand the basics of Project Management 101. So some of that stuff doesn't go away. It's not described in the 16-page Scrum guide. No offense to Scrum, it kind of assumes that the person in that role kind of has that already. So, basic project management skills still are required, albeit different kinds of skills. So you have the same kind of goals in construction, and you have goals for transitioning. I won't go through each of them, but you get the idea. Now, how you actually do these things will depend on the kind of organization you are. Pragmatic Agile. You want to go for the minimal amount of work to get stakeholder consensus, which is the milestone in inception, right? So what the book does is use a goal-driven approach. And the notation for the goal-driven approach is this. Let's say you've got a goal for form the initial team. Well, things you need to think about, issues or factors. What's the source of my team? What's its size? How is it structured? Who are the team members? Is it geographically distributed? Who's supporting the team? Do you have coaches, mentors, etc.? And what's their availability? Because Agile would suggest that everybody on an Agile team should be 100% dedicated to the project. Hopefully that's what you have. You have people 100% dedicated to one project. However, how many of you out there actually have people working on multiple projects at one time? Yeah, okay. That's the reality. So what we do in the process decision framework is to say, there's ideal choices, everyone 100% dedicated. If you need to make compromises, here's some strategies to be most effective in those situations. That is what the goal-driven approach is all about. So as an example, if I'm geographically distributed, my different choices might be co-located. That's really what we want. That makes a most effective team. Well, okay, maybe you're partially dispersed. You've got a few people working from home. Maybe you're fully dispersed. Everybody works from home. Maybe you have distributed sub-teams, maybe on different continents. Okay? Not what you want to do, but maybe you have to deal with it. And that's why we call it a process decision framework, to give you some answers where this is the great position to be in. If I have to step back and make a compromise, what are my choices? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of each choice to help you make better decisions? Okay? So here's an example of a complete goal diagram. And I've used a very simple example just to sort of convey how it works. I need to develop a common vision in inception. Very lightweight, okay? Well, my choices, what is my strategy? Is it going to be driven by the team itself? Is it going to be driven by the sponsor themselves? Or is it going to be collaborative? We work with the sponsors to come up with a common vision. Oh, by the way, what I didn't show is if it's bolded and italicized, that's a good place to start. So if you're new to Agile, you don't always want, the arrow indicates where you want to get to. That's the best choice. Sometimes you can't start with the best choice. It makes sense to start with something that's not, because you're new. Okay, so that's the notation. The bold and italicized is a good place to start. If there's an arrow, that's where you want to get to. I'll give you, that's your vision strategy. Level of detail. Well, no vision whatsoever, not preferred. A detailed vision, also not preferred, because we're agile here. Lightweight is good. This thing's called information radiators, where you maybe draw a few things on flip charts and post them in your workroom, and that's your vision. That would be ideal. Not always possible, but that would be ideal. Level of agreement. If you have people on your team, it'd be nice if you had consensus about the vision and everybody agrees we're going to use an agile approach. Consensus is sometimes hard to get, but that's where you'd like to get to. So maybe you've got general agreement. You've got a couple of people that don't agree. So strive for general agreement. You get the idea? So this is the goals diagram. Now in the book, I'll show you one more example. Secure funding. No project, you don't just start coding without funding, yes? You've got to have some funding. So if you have to get funding, what is your strategy? Fixed price, not a good strategy for agile projects. I understand some of you have to deal with that reality. It's not a good strategy. But if it is, the book will say, here's some approach for being more successful if you have to do that. Ideally, you get to stage gate or even better, time and materials. The best is time and materials, but giving people performance bonuses for hitting certain targets. Now, the reason I brought this one up is because I wanted to show an example of a table from the book. Here's a table for comparing funding strategies. So you have fixed price, the advantages of which there aren't many. In fact, I'll read this one. We're a bit cheeky with this one. The advantages of fixed price provide stakeholders with an exact cost to hope for. You got to have some fun, right? But many disadvantages, and then considerations if you're trying to want to be more successful. Okay, so that's an example of a table in the book to help you, if you have to deal with compromises, deal with them in the best way possible. Let's talk a bit about roles. Scrum has 3 roles. Scrum Master, Product Owner, Team Member, awesome. Where's the Business Analyst? Where's the Project Manager? Anybody here Business Analyst? Do you know, I do talks for the IIBA. You guys heard of the IIBA? International Institute of Business Analysts? One of the talks I do is there a role for business analysts on agile projects? Packs the room of business analysts who are scared about not having a role on agile projects, right? They want to know, is there a place for me in agile? There is, okay? There certainly is, especially for large projects. And it's a talk, so I can't spend a lot of time talking about it, but suffice it to say, BAs bring skills that you won't find in most product owners, like elicitation skills, how to get the requirements out of the minds of the product owner. You know, what is important, what do you need, the ability to ask open-ended questions, to do elicitation of brainstorming, prototyping, storyboards, interviews, questionnaires, all those things, business process modeling, notation, all those things in their toolkit that you're not going to find in most product owners. So the key is figuring out how to get them to work together and still have a single source, a single voice of the customer that the development team can get the answers from. Okay, so there is a role. But anyway, in DAD, we actually add a couple of roles, and then we have secondary roles. Now, please don't misunderstand this picture. This doesn't mean that there's 10 roles in DAD. It just says for large projects, like the one at Canadian Pacific, I had 25 people in my room on my team, 25. So this idea that you can only do a Scrum project with 9 people, you can do it with more. You just have to do things differently. And I had 75 people outside the room. So for a 100-person team, you're going to have some specialists. Like I had Linux specialists, I had UX and a UX specialist, a database specialist. You will have specialists. But the important point here is we have this thing called architecture owner that Scrum doesn't have, that I think is a very, very good role to have in a project. It's been very successful for us, and I'll tell you a bit more about that right now. So we have this idea of, how many people here are not familiar with what a product owner is? Okay, most people? Okay, good. Then I won't talk through the Scrum roles, but I will say that team lead is our name for Scrum Master. Again, if you want to call it Scrum Master, I got no problem with that, okay? But coming out of the gate, let's call it team lead, because that's what they are. And architecture owner, by the way, it's not project manager. Do not call them project manager, please. But I don't know if I got time to talk about that. By the way, after the talk, we'll stick around for a bit and be happy to answer any questions that you have, okay? I'm not going anywhere. So if you have any more questions about some of the details, please come up afterwards. But architecture owner, I want to talk about that because that's a differentiator between DAD and other methods like Scrum. It's nice that everybody on a Scrum team is team members, right? These are cross-functioning, generalizing specialists. They know they can do other things besides code. They can test. They can maybe do a bit of requirements. They can do other things. They're multi-skilled people, and that's a good thing. And Scrum has this idea that the team makes the decisions. The team manages itself. There's no lead per se. But you know what? Sometimes I've been in several situations where my developers have almost come to physical blows around a whiteboard arguing about a design approach. At the end of the day, somebody needs to make the decision. It's nice to say, well, the team will make it, but somebody needs to make it and be accountable for it. Now, I'm not saying they get fired or anything, but they know it's their responsibility to make good decisions. Additionally, the architecture owner's responsibility includes making sure that you're consistent with what the rest of the organization is doing. So like the product owner understanding what the higher level business goals are, the architecture owner needs to understand what the enterprise is doing on the architecture side, understand what the guidelines are, understand what assets are available to be reused. So if anybody on the team, so you avoid the situation where the team just starts writing everything from scratch, right? There is somebody in the team that can be held accountable if you've got some rogue activities going on within the team.